Premieres glittered. Velvet ropes guided the elite. Studio logos gleamed with confidence. And then, the box office doors opened to collective silence. Millions burned. Careers bruised. What if I told you that 1977, the year of Star Wars and Close Encounters, was also Hollywood's graveyard for studio hubris? This list exposes the 14 films that miscalculated everything: timing, audience, tone, and ambition. The myths made by marketing collided with the brutal truth of the ledger. Let's walk behind the curtain. Number 1. The Turning Point, 1977. 20th Century Fox distributed this prestige drama directed by Mike Nichols and starring Anne Bancroft and Shirley MacLaine. On paper, it was a slam dunk. 2 Oscar-caliber actresses, a celebrated director, and a script about female friendship crossing generational lines. The studio positioned it as adult-oriented prestige cinema at a moment when serious dramas still commanded theatrical audiences. But the public didn't bite. The film opened in March to middling reviews. Critics found it emotionally distant. Despite its earnest intentions, the marketing campaign failed to clarify the narrative. Audiences couldn't articulate what the story actually was, beyond 2 women talking. Meanwhile, Star Wars was reshaping moviegoing 3 months later, and adult dramas suddenly felt quaint. Production costs sat around $6 million, a significant bet that failed to recoup domestically. Fox pulled it quickly, though the studio quietly avoided discussing its failure in trade papers. The film vanished so thoroughly that even comprehensive film histories gloss over it, yet it signaled something ominous. Even marquee-name talent couldn't guarantee returns anymore. The industry's old formula, trust the director, trust the stars, trust prestige, was collapsing. And then came the spectacles that audiences actually wanted. Number 2. Exorcist II, The Heretic, 1977. Warner Brothers greenlit this sequel to 1973's phenomenon, riding the coattails of the most profitable horror film ever made. Director John Boorman and star Linda Blair returned, with a reported budget of $13 million. The studio expected this to be an easy cash grab, a guaranteed multiplier on the original's success. Instead, they created a befuddling, incoherent nightmare. Boorman's vision was deliberately abstract, mystical, operatic, far removed from the visceral terror of the first film. The narrative spiraled into incomprehensibility, astral projection, African rituals, locusts, and a firefall climax that audiences couldn't parse. Critics demolished it. Variety called it pretentious drivel masquerading as horror. Test screenings had already flagged disaster, but Warner Brothers committed to the May release regardless. The film earned $30.9 million domestically, a number that sounds respectable until you factor in the massive P&A spend and theater expectations. In profit margins, it hemorrhaged. Word of mouth killed it within 2 weeks. The studio panicked and recut it for re-release, but damage was done. Industry insiders viewed it as one of the year's most spectacular collapses, particularly for a property that had no excuse to fail. The legacy? Pure infamy. It became the textbook example of how not to sequelize a phenomenon. Yet it also taught Warner Brothers to never again hand a blockbuster property to an auteur indulging his own avant-garde whims. Meanwhile, other studios were learning the hard way that name recognition alone didn't guarantee gold. Number 3. Roller Boogie, 1977. Film 77/Cinema Group's disco roller skating musical starred Linda Blair and James Van Patten. The film's premise was nakedly commercial. Capitalize on 2 unstoppable 1977 trends simultaneously: disco and roller skating. With a modest budget of approximately $2.2 million, it seemed foolproof. The film was a cynical, soulless cash grab, and audiences felt it immediately. The narrative was wafer-thin. A young woman discovers roller disco and finds love amid neon and horn sections. The soundtrack was aggressively mediocre, the skating sequences were poorly choreographed, and the chemistry between leads was non-existent. It opened in limited release and barely expanded. Critics ignored it. which was perhaps merciful. The tragic part? Linda Blair was contractually locked into appearing in assembly line B pictures. She'd been the voice of demonic possession 2 years earlier. Now she was reduced to roller disco filler. The film barely recouped its modest budget in theatrical release, and it never recovered its reputation. It became a footnote in the disco exploitation graveyard of the late 70s, a film so transparently mercenary that it repelled the very audiences it courted. Yet it also exposed Linda Blair's desperation to work beyond horror, a desperation that would haunt her for years. And then, some studios decided to resurrect properties that should have stayed buried. Number 4. MacArthur, 1977. Universal Pictures' biographical epic of General Douglas MacArthur starred Gregory Peck in the title role, with director Joseph Sargent at the helm. The budget ballooned to approximately $13 million, substantial for a military biography. Universal believed the prestige casting and historical gravitas would attract the older demographic that still frequented theaters in 1977. But the studio misread the moment entirely. Political biographies were not 1977's appetite. The film was grandly mounted, but narratively static. Long stretches of military strategy replaced dramatic tension. Audiences wanted either personal psychology or action spectacle. MacArthur offered tedious procedural history, as the release timing competed directly with summer blockbusters and eventually with Star Wars, which obliterated everything in its path. Peck's acclaimed performance couldn't salvage the enterprise. The film earned only $14.6 million domestically against its $13 million production cost. And that's before accounting for print and advertising expenses exceeding $8 million. Universal took a financial bath. Critics praised Peck's dignity while noting the film's ponderous pacing. Industry observers chalked it up to the death of the prestige biographical epic, a format that had already begun its decline in the early 70s. The film's failure signaled that even bankable stars and respectable source material couldn't transcend a fundamental problem. The audience demographic was shifting younger, and older viewers were abandoning theaters altogether. Yet some studios persisted with outdated formulas anyway. Number 5. Viva Knievel, 1977. Warner Brothers distributed this daredevil biopic directed by Gordon Douglas, starring Evil Knievel as himself, alongside Gene Kelly, Lauren Hutton, and Leslie Nielsen. The film was green-lighted on the assumption that Knievel's massive celebrity would translate to box office gold, much like the 1971 George Hamilton vehicle Viva Knievel, which had been hugely profitable. Warner Brothers budgeted approximately $4 million, confident the stunt footage alone would compensate for the threadbare narrative. The film was an embarrassing vanity project. Knievel, a non-actor with stilted line readings and charisma that evaporated on screen, couldn't carry scenes. His character, a combination Messiah vigilante orphanage savior, was incomprehensible. Gene Kelly, brilliant decades earlier, looked exhausted. And Warner Brothers released it in June 1977 to devastating indifference. The film earned only $2.4 million domestically against its production and marketing budget combined, a total catastrophe. But worse came 3 months later, when Viva Knievel himself attacked promoter Shelley Saltman with a baseball bat, an incident that destroyed his public image overnight. His conviction obliterated the film's commercial potential internationally. Warner Brothers couldn't market a product associated with a man now infamous for violence. The film disappeared almost entirely from circulation, briefly resurfacing only in home video era. On number 6, Damnation Alley, 1977. 20th Century Fox adapted Roger Zelazny's cult novel about post-apocalyptic survival, starring Jan Michael Vincent and George Peppard. The budget was approximately $11 million, with special effects budgets particularly elevated. Fox believed the science fiction market was expanding and positioned this as prestige genre entertainment. The production was chaotic. Director Jack Smite constantly battled the producers over the film's tone. The script rewrites were endless. The special effects, particularly the infamous giant mutant scorpions, looked cheap and unconvincing. The narrative was a plodding road movie, interminable between action sequences that underwhelmed. Jan Michael Vincent's performance was wooden. George Peppard seemed bored. The film opened in October to scathing reviews. Critics called the special effects embarrassing. The scorpion sequences invited unintended laughter. It earned $25.5 million domestically, which sounds respectable until you account for the expensive marketing campaign and the $11 million production cost. The profit margins were razor-thin, and word-of-mouth destroyed repeat business. Fox took a financial loss once all ancillary costs were calculated. The film's failure reinforced Hollywood's distrust of ambitious science fiction outside the Star Wars template. It also proved that a respectable budget for effects still couldn't compensate for incoherent direction and script dysfunction. The cult novel's devoted readers felt betrayed. General audiences found it boring. Yet other studios had already learned this lesson expensively. The number 7. Demon Seed, 1977. Metro-Goldwyn-Mayer distributed this science fiction horror film directed by Donald Cammell, starring Julie Christie. The premise was provocative. A sentient computer becomes obsessed with creating a hybrid with a human woman. MGM envisioned it as cerebral science fiction with commercial appeal. Riding the wave of 2001. A Space Odyssey's prestige. The budget was approximately $8 million. But the film couldn't commit to its own premise. It wavered between horror and philosophical meditation, unable to sustain either. Julie Christie's character was underwritten, and her vulnerability to technological violation felt exploitative rather than terrifying. The special effects representing the computer's manifestation looked laughable, essentially a glowing crystal phallic symbol. As the pacing was glacial, audiences grew restless. MGM released it in May to poor reviews. Critics found it simultaneously dull and tasteless. It earned only $11.2 million domestically, a catastrophic shortfall against production and marketing costs combined. The studio pulled it quickly. Television rights eventually salvaged some revenue, but the theatrical run was an unmitigated disaster. The film's failure signaled that science fiction needed either spectacular action or genuine philosophical depth, not muddled attempts at both. Cammell's filmmaking fell into obscurity for years. MGM learned that star power alone, Julie Christie should have been a draw, couldn't compensate for a fundamentally confused film. And then came the musicals that nobody wanted. Number 8. High Anxiety, 1977. 20th Century Fox released Mel Brooks' directorial project about a psychiatrist afraid of heights, starring Brooks himself. With a reported budget of $6 million, Fox believed Brooks' comedic reputation would guarantee box office returns. The premise was a spoof of Hitchcock thrillers, which should have positioned it as prestige entertainment. The film was uneven. Brooks' physical comedy occasionally landed, but the Hitchcock parody framework felt forced and exhausted. The script was overstuffed with gags that killed pacing. Many jokes landed flat or felt desperate. The supporting cast elevated the material, but couldn't salvage Brooks' meandering directorial instincts. Critics were divided. Some praised the audacity, others found it irritating and self-indulgent. The film earned $86.9 million domestically, which appears strong, but that figure includes earnings from multiple re-releases and is misleading. The initial theatrical run was modest, and word of mouth cooled quickly. Once you subtract marketing costs, the profit margins tightened considerably. The film underperformed against Paramount's summer releases and never achieved blockbuster status. Yet High Anxiety proved more durable than many 1977 failures. It found cult appreciation and lingered in reruns, developing a legacy that softened its initial commercial disappointment. Brooks' reputation survived intact, unlike other directors whose failures damaged their standing permanently. Meanwhile, some films were so conceptually broken that no marketing campaign could save them. At number 9, The Last Wave, 1977. Australian director Peter Weir's supernatural thriller starred Richard Chamberlain as a lawyer investigating indigenous prophecies and apocalyptic visions, produced by Australian World Productions. With a modest budget of approximately $2 million, the film was distributed in limited release by United Motion Picture Company. Weir had gained notice on the Australian Film Festival circuit, and American distributors saw potential for an art house crossover. The film's narrative was deliberately obtuse. Weir favored atmospheric dread over exposition, leaving audiences uncertain whether the apocalyptic visions were real, psychological, or spiritual. Chamberlain's performance was appropriately confused but ultimately passive. The cinematography was haunting but glacial. American audiences didn't know what to make of it. Was it horror? Drama? Philosophical meditation? UMC released it theatrically in select cities, but the distributorship lacked resources for wide marketing or sustained exhibition. It earned approximately $850,000 domestically against its production budget. The studio quickly pivoted to cable television and international sales to recover costs. Critical reviews were respectful, but far from enthusiastic. Most critics found it intriguing but exhausting. The film's legacy proved more interesting than its commercial run. Weir's reputation grew through subsequent films like Picnic at Hanging Rock, and The Last Wave gained retrospective appreciation as a precursor to supernatural horror. Yet in 1977, it was a non-starter commercially. On evidence that art house sensibility required extensive festival circuits and specialized distribution, not traditional studio backing. Yet other failures were more immediate and more humiliating. Number 10. Which Way Is Up? 1977. Columbia Pictures distributed this comedy directed by Michael Schultz, starring Richard Pryor in a dual role. With a modest budget of approximately $2 million, Columbia banked on Pryor's rising comedy superstardom to deliver laughs. The premise was innocent. A young man returns home and causes chaos. Pryor's comedy was already becoming legendary, so this should have been a safe commercial bet. The film was tediously scripted. Pryor's talent for improvisation was constrained by a thin narrative framework. The dual role gimmick quickly exhausted itself. Pryor playing both characters in scenes together wasn't particularly inventive or funny. The supporting cast, Lynette McKee, Morgan Woodward, couldn't elevate the material. The pacing dragged interminably between rare laughs. Columbia released it in April to poor reviews. Critics appreciated Pryor's effort, but found the script beneath his capabilities. The film earned approximately $20.1 million domestically, which sounds respectable until you factor in aggressive marketing spend and distribution costs. The profit margins were minimal. Audiences abandoned the film after the opening weekend. Word of mouth killed it. Pryor himself later disowned the project, noting that his comedic power required either concert footage or improvisation-heavy scripts. This screenplay was neither. Columbia's bet on star power without adequate material cost them significantly. Yet other comedies were failing even more spectacularly. Number 11. The Island of Dr. Moreau, 1977. American International Pictures distributed this H.G. Wells adaptation, directed by Don Taylor and starring Burt Lancaster as the titular mad scientist, with Michael York as a shipwrecked engineer and Barbara Carrera as a mysterious island inhabitant. Lancaster's involvement promised prestige. The creature makeup by Oscar winner John Chambers suggested genuine production values. IP budgeted approximately $5.5 million, substantial for the studio, betting Lancaster's name would attract both highbrow and B-movie audiences. The film was glacially paced and narratively inert. Lancaster's performance, though dignified, lacked menace. He seemed too fundamentally decent to play a mad scientist willing to torture creatures in The House of Pain. The script wandered between medical drama and horror, without committing to either. The makeup effects, while occasionally creepy, mostly looked like awkward community theater costumes. Michael York spent 90% of his screen time observing rather than acting. AIP released it in July 1977 to poor reviews and modest box office. The film earned approximately $6.5 million domestically, a shortfall against production costs and marketing spend combined. The studio quickly abandoned it. Critics called it tedious. Audiences found it boring. Lancaster's reputation, fortunately, remained intact. This adaptation simply fell between commercial and artistic success, satisfying neither audience. Number 12. Thunder and Lightning, 1977. 20th Century Fox distributed this swamp-based action comedy starring David Carradine and Kate Jackson. The film was set in rural Georgia and involved moonshine bootleggers, car chases, and romantic entanglement. With a budget of approximately $3.5 million, Fox believed the action-comedy blend and chemistry between Carradine and Jackson would appeal to drive-in audiences and regional markets. The film was poorly assembled. The humor felt forced and dated, pratfalls and muddy physical comedy that audiences had already exhausted. Carradine's performance was lethargic. Jackson's talents were completely wasted in a nothing role. The car chases were competently executed but unremarkable. The editing lacked momentum, as the film felt like a television pilot that somehow received theatrical funding. Fox released it in limited distribution, September, and it generated approximately $2.8 million domestically against the $3.5 million production budget. The studio pulled it quickly, declining even to expand the release. Word of mouth was devastating. Audiences felt bored and insulted. Critics ignored it. The film's failure contributed to a crucial shift. Ford and other studios realized that action comedy hybrids required either genuine comedy talent or spectacular stunt work, not merely a mixture of both half-heartedly executed. Carradine's career took another step downward. Jackson escaped to television, where she found genuine success, yet even prestige-adjacent failures were still coming. Number 13. Bobby Deerfield, 1977. Columbia Pictures distributed this romantic drama directed by Sidney Lumet and starring Al Pacino and Martha Keller. Lumet was a celebrated director. Pacino was post-Dog Day Afternoon prestige. The budget was approximately $8 million. Columbia envisioned this as sophisticated adult drama that could attract the remaining theatrical audience for intimate character studies. The film was narcissistic and tedious. Pacino played a race car driver who falls for a Swiss woman, Keller, while exploring his emotional repression. Lumet's direction was ponderous. The script by Alvin Sargent felt like a half-finished therapy session. Pacino's performance was introspective to the point of catatonia. He sat in cars and contemplated existence while the audience contemplated leaving the theater. The European cinematography was lovely, but couldn't compensate for the narrative vacuum. Columbia released it in September to indifferent reviews. Critics praised the technical craft while damning the emotional emptiness. It earned $7.1 million domestically, a catastrophic failure against an $8 million production budget that didn't account for marketing. Approximately $5 million additional. The studio took a substantial loss. Word of mouth was poison. Even Pacino fans avoided it. The film's failure taught Columbia a crucial lesson. Star power and directorial prestige meant nothing if the script was intrinsically unengaging. Pacino's reputation, surprisingly, survived. His next projects returned to narrative momentum and compelling character arcs. The film disappeared completely, on resurfacing only in complete filmographies and retrospectives examining directorial missteps. Yet one final catastrophe awaited. Number 14. The Sentinel, 1977. Universal Pictures distributed this supernatural horror film, directed by Michael Winner and starring Michael Caine, Christina Rains, and a grotesque parade of deformed demons. The budget was approximately $4 million. Winner, known for sleazy thrillers, leaned into sensationalism. The premise involved a young woman who discovers a Manhattan townhouse is literally a gateway to hell, guarded by an ancient sentinel. The film was simultaneously disgusting and incompetent. Winner's direction was cynical and incoherent. The narrative made no logical sense. If this gateway existed, why was it suddenly relevant now? Rains's performance was appropriately hysterical. But the film's primary attractions were grotesque images of deformed actors paraded as hell's minions, a choice so exploitative that it alienated even horror enthusiasts. The climactic revelation was absurd. The dialogue was stilted theological nonsense. Universal released it in November to horror reviews. Critics called it tasteless and stupid. It earned approximately $14.9 million domestically, which initially seemed acceptable until you factor in extensive marketing, $6 million, and the studio's disappointing attachment to a film they knew was problematic. Repeat business evaporated instantly. The film found cultish appreciation from splatter cinema enthusiasts, but mainstream audiences rejected it conclusively. And yet the Sentinel also proved durable in certain circles. Its transgressive vulgarity eventually earned a retrospective cult following among horror devotees who appreciated its complete disregard for good taste. 1977's box office graveyard reveals Hollywood at a fundamental crossroads. Studios clung to formulas that had calcified, prestige dramas, aging stars, experimental projects granted budgets they didn't earn, and cynical genre exercises that underestimated audience intelligence. Meanwhile, Star Wars had fundamentally altered the game. Audiences wanted spectacle, narrative clarity, and mythic scope, not introspection and ambiguity. The 14 films here didn't fail because they were ambitious. They failed because they miscalculated what audiences wanted in an industry rapidly transforming beneath their feet. So commercial failure doesn't diminish artistic achievement, and some of these films have aged into curiosity and occasional appreciation. But in 1977, the studio system learned an expensive lesson. The old playbook was obsolete. What worked was spectacle, not sentiment, myth, not meditation. And those lessons would reshape every decision Hollywood made for decades to come. The curtain had fallen on an era, and these catastrophes were its epitaph.